Thank you for a wonderful welcome. And I think it was such a great welcome, I'm going to welcome you with chimpanzee language. And there are 3 people here who could answer me, Martin and Richard and Elizabeth. So when I greet you as a chimpanzee would, hello, this is me, Jane, I'm expecting you 3 to reply. You can also join in if you like, but it's It was wonderful how the house lights went up. Now they've gone down again. Can they stay up? I like to see the people I'm talking to. I'm so tired of doing Zooms when all I'm looking at is a green spot. It's wonderful to see people out there. Thank you. So obviously, I'm really honored to be receiving this prize, not only because it's associated with one of the great naturalists of our time and the great natural history writers of our time, but because it's awarded to me for natural history writing. And I think, when I look back over my childhood, first of all, I was born loving animals and being fascinated by them. And I was lucky to have a very supportive mother. And one story which many of you may have heard, but I'm going to tell it again for a special reason. And that's, we lived in London, not many animals there, but Mum took me for a holiday into the country onto a farm, a proper farm, animals moving around, grazing in the fields. And one of my jobs was to help collect the hens' eggs. And they were pecking around in the farmyard, mostly laying their eggs in these little hen houses. And my job was to go and open the nest box and take the eggs into the kitchen. So apparently I began asking everybody, where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a big enough hole. Nobody told me. So what I remember vividly is seeing this hen. She was brown, and she was going into one of these hen houses, thinking, she's going to lay an egg, crawling after her. Huge mistake. Squawks of fear, she flew out. I can still close my eyes and see the wing touching my cheek. And I suppose in my little 4-year-old brain, I thought, well, no hen will come in here. There's something dangerous in this place. So I went into an empty hen house. I think there were about 6 of them, and waited. And apparently I was gone for 4 hours, aged 4. My mother didn't know where I was. They were all searching for me. In fact, she was about to call the police when this little child covered in straw rushed up to the house. And instead of getting mad at me, how dare you go off without telling anyone, don't you dare do it again, she sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. I can close my eyes and see it now. And the reason I think this is important is, isn't that the making of a little naturalist? The curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning the importance of patience. A different kind of mother, how dare you go off without telling us, don't you ever dare do it again, might have crushed that early scientific curiosity, and I might not have done what I've done. So when I was growing up, the television hadn't been invented. And so I was learning from being out in nature, where I tried to spend as much of every day as possible watching the squirrels and the birds and the insects around our home in the south of England. And books. Again, my mother started giving me books about animals when I was very young, 5 or 6, something like that, thinking I would learn to read more quickly if the subject was something I was passionate about. And I was 8 years old when I met Dr. Dolittle. I'm sure many of you have read Dr. Dolittle. Oh, how I wanted a parrot to teach me animal language. And for a while I pretended to my friends that I could understand what the dogs were saying and the birds were singing, and they believed me. But anyway, then when I was 10, I'd saved up enough money. We'd had very little money. World War II was raging. We, my sister and I, had gone to live with Mum and her mother. And we got a few pennies, pocket money a week, and I saved mine up and spent hours in a second-hand bookshop. Funny little wizened old man. He had no idea where any of the books were. They were piled higgledy-piggledy on the floor. And I spent hours and hours rummaging around. And on this one occasion, there was this little book, and I just had enough money to buy it. I don't know what it would be worth today, but back then it was 1 and 6pence. And I just had enough money, and I took it home, took it up my favorite tree, because I also loved trees and plants, and read it from cover to cover. That little book was Tarzan of the Apes. Well, of course, I fell passionately in love with that lord of the jungle. And what did he do? He married the wrong Jane. Yeah. Well, that, of course, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but that book began my dream. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. I'd always loved writing. I began writing stories when I was 5, which I dictated to my mother. And as I, went through school, English literature was one of my favorite subjects. We were asked to write essays, and I always got very bad marks because of my spelling and my writing, not what I wrote about. And it wasn't until I was in the 6th form that I found a mistress who actually read what I'd written. Instead of getting C's and so on, I started getting A+. And fortunately, before that, my mother had again read what I'd written, and congratulated me on how I was writing. So I think these prizes, in the name of Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, help us to reconnect with nature. It reminds us of the importance of nature in our daily lives. Thoreau was born a naturalist. He was never trained as one, but he worked in the field. He had a great gift for observation and making accurate notes. In a way, that's how I began when I went to Gombe National Park to study chimpanzees. I hadn't been to college. And interestingly enough, his famous book, Walden Pond, was written about, 170 years ago? Long time ago. But it shows very clearly his love for nature, his attention to detail, the way he loved being out in nature by himself, just as I do. I feel quite a strong connection to this amazing man. And even back then, 170 years ago, he was concerned about the materialism that was growing up and the lack of respect for nature. How shocked he would be if he came back today to see what's happened. I think everybody here understands what we're doing to the planet. I won't go into it. Safe to say, we're going through very dark times, aren't we, right now? Politically, socially, and especially environmentally. And, we're destroying forests, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We're polluting the ocean, which is the other great lung of the world, absorbing carbon dioxide and giving us oxygen to breathe. And we are creating, by our reckless burning of fossil fuel and various other things that we do, we're creating these so-called greenhouse gases that blanket the surface of the globe, trap the heat of the sun, and cause the climate to gradually warm up. I don't know how people can honestly say that they don't believe in climate change. And more of them the deniers are saying, well, yes, the climate is changing, but it's nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with us, it's everything to do with us. And yes, there are climatic changes if you go through evolution, but the speed of which the planet is heating up now is unprecedented. The speed with which species are becoming extinct is unprecedented. We're in the middle of the 6th great extinction of animals and plants on the planet, and it's made by us. Everywhere I go, and up until this pandemic, I was traveling all over the world about 300 days a year, and everywhere I was finding people who said, well, the weather isn't like it used to be. At Gombe, we used to have a short rains and a long rains and a dry season. Today, well, the long season and the short season are joined up. We can have rain in the dry season and dryness in what used to be the wet season. And this change in climate is leading to ever worse hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes, worse and more frequent flooding, worse and more frequent droughts, particularly in the global south, but everywhere really. And these terrible, terrible fires. For the first time in recorded history, there have been fires up in the Arctic Circle. It's really scary what's happening in the world today. And so, as I say, these millions of climate deniers, they're either stupid or they're just putting their heads under the sand and pretending not to recognize it. Another real problem that's arisen is that as sea levels rise, as the water is heated up, and as the ice is melting, so some areas of land, especially ocean islands, have become uninhabitable. And this is leading to an increasing number of climate refugees, driven from areas where drought or flooding makes it impossible for them to carry on with their lives in the land where they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this brings me to a question about this. I studied chimpanzees in Gombe for many, many years, and one of the really dramatic findings, because when I began, nobody knew anything about wild chimps. It was the first real study. And one of the first things that was so striking was how their behavior is so like ours. We know today that biologically they and the bonobo are our closest living relatives, and we share about 98.6 or 7% of the composition of our DNA with them. But it's the behavior, the kissing, the embracing, the patting on the back, the nonverbal communication, the complex social structure, the male-dominated society, the differences between individuals, which spills over into the way mothers raise their children. The long childhood, because like us, they need to learn a lot before they can move out into society. The fact that there is an aggressive, dark side to their nature. They're capable of brutality and a kind of primitive war between neighboring communities, because they're very territorial. But they also show love and compassion and true altruism, just like us. But of course we're different, aren't we? If there was a whole area in front of me of chimpanzees, there would be no silence, I can assure you. There'd be an awful lot of action going on. And anyway, we're not like chimpanzees. So what's the biggest difference? Having talked about the similarities, the explosive development of our intellect, which may, at least in part, have been triggered by the fact that at some time in our evolution, we developed language using words so that we could actually teach our children about things that weren't present. We could make plans for the distant future. Most important, we can bring people together from different walks of life with different knowledge sets to try and solve problems communally. And so I would suspect that we're the most intellectual creature that's ever walked the planet. And note I say intellectual rather than intelligent. And so how come that we're destroying our planet? I think it's fantastic that now that this intellect has created a rocket that went up to Mars, a little camera that crawls around taking photographs of the surface of Mars. We used to think maybe we could live there, but now we know we can't, unless we build a bubble, which most people don't want to live in a bubble. And I'm not talking about COVID bubbles, because that's something new. But anyway, because we've managed to go up into space, there are these photographs of planet Earth, and it's really moving. You see this little green and blue globe, and it's surrounded by the dark, cold immensity of space. That's our home. It's our only home, the only home we'll know in our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children and great-grandchildren. So how come we're destroying it? Is there perhaps a disconnect between this clever brain and love and compassion? Poetically, we seek that in the human heart. And we're making decisions based on, how will it help me now? How will it help the next shareholders meeting or my next political campaign? And we're not thinking, so many people, about how this decision will affect future generations. So here we are, the most intellectual, but we've lost wisdom. It's not wise to be destroying the future of our children. And when you meet people and say, well, do you care about the future of your children and theirs? People say yes. You say yes, but look what we're doing to their future. We're destroying it. We've been stealing it probably since the Industrial Revolution. So, Thoreau insisted that people think about the fact that we are part and parcel of the natural world. Yes, indeed, we are not only a part of the natural world, we depend on it. We depend on it even in the middle of a city for every breath of air we take, every sip of water, every mouthful of food. But what is it we depend on? We depend on healthy ecosystems. I learned about the ecosystem, the forest ecosystem in Gombe, where every little species has some role to play. And I see it as like a great tapestry, a living tapestry, beautiful and glorious, with all these interrelated species. So when a species becomes extinct in that ecosystem, it's like pulling a thread from that tapestry. And if enough threads are pulled, then that tapestry will hang in tatters and the ecosystem will collapse. And that's what's happening. And it's the biodiversity of the ecosystems that we're losing in this sixth great extinction. So it's not surprising, is it, that people become depressed and apathetic, because, as I say, we are living in dark times. And as it's healthy ecosystems upon which we rely, we're destroying our lives even now in many places of the world. So people are always saying to me, Jane, you've seen so much of the harm to the planet, not just reading about it, but going, seeing to it, talking to people, getting the feel inside me of what's going wrong. Do you really have hope? You've seen cruelty, you've seen war, the results of war, you've seen refugees in helpless situations. Can you really have hope? I do have hope, and I'll tell you the reasons, but there's a big but. The hope, I strongly believe, and luckily scientists support me, that there's a window of time when, if we get together, we can at least slow down climate change, at least slow down loss of biodiversity. But, as I say, it's a big but. Do we have time? But nevertheless, we have to solve various problems. And these are major problems. They're not easy to solve. And just very quickly what these problems are, we have to solve the unsustainable lifestyles of so many people who have way more than they need and are acting as though this planet has infinite. Thank you. Well, acting as though this planet has infinite natural resources, but they're not, they're finite. And in some places, because of this unrealistic demand that people and businesses and governments are placing on them, they're running out of those resources faster than Mother Nature can replenish them. So Thoreau, way back then, 170 years ago, was concerned about apathy, the apathy of people. And if we lose hope, we become apathetic. If we all become apathetic and do nothing, we're doomed. And Thoreau was thinking about that 170 years ago. He was worried about materialism and what it would do to the planet, and how right he was. Those economists who are thinking less now, but that there could be unlimited economic development on this planet with its finite natural resources. And that short-term gain was more important than protection of the environment in the long term. How right he was. But again, I doubt he could have imagined quite how far this apathy and materialism would have taken us to where it is today. We've also got to solve poverty. Some people don't seem to get the connection between poverty and climate change and destruction of the environment. But when I first realized that chimpanzees across Africa were decreasing in number and forests were disappearing, I went to Africa to find out more about the problems faced by chimps, the habitat destruction, the bushmeat trade, commercial hunting of wild animals for food, shooting mothers to sell their babies as pets locally or overseas, with the animal trafficking, chimpanzees caught in wire snares set by hunters. I was learning all about those things, working out how we could care for the orphans who'd lost their mothers in sanctuaries. But I was also learning an awful lot about the plight faced by so many Africans living in and around chimpanzee habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education, and the degradation of the land as their populations grew and as people moved further and further into chimp habitat with their cattle. And the land was definitely becoming increasingly degraded, less fertile, so they needed more land. And another problem we have to solve is ignorance, because an awful lot of what's going on in the world today is due to ignorance. There are people, either they don't have the opportunity for a good education, or they just listen to fake news and believe what they're told, because they're not educated enough to try and sort out what's real from what's false. So education is tremendously important, and more people are realizing that. And I read a lovely quote the other day when trying to convince somebody to understand some of these things, that it's very hard to teach somebody something when their job depends on, I've got it wrong here, wait a minute. It's very hard if your job depends on not understanding to understand the problem. And I think you can think about that. Then there's industrial agriculture with its heavy use of pesticides and herbicides and so much artificial about it. And especially when we come to animal agriculture, intensive animal agriculture, factory farms, unbelievably cruel, but actually, destroying huge areas of habitat to grow the grain, to feed these billions of animals in horribly cruel conditions, and using lots of water to change vegetable to animal protein. And huge amounts of methane are produced during digestion, and that's one of the very virulent greenhouse gases. There's many other problems, but those are the main ones. We have to consider human population growth and the growth of our livestock. People don't want to talk about that, and people say it's politically incorrect to talk about that. I was told that in the early 1970s when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book, The Population Bomb. And right from then, I said, I must talk about this. It's really important. And when I was told, well, I'd be heckled and hated and all the rest of it, I invented voluntary population optimization. Nobody could argue with that. So, but we do need to think about it because there's 7.7 roughly billion of us on the planet today, and as I say already, in some places we're running out of natural resources, and it's estimated there'll be closer to 10 billion in 2050. So if we carry on with business as usual, what will happen? I wouldn't want to know about it. I'm glad I'm 88. I won't be here at that time. And then, of course, we've got all the social problems, the discrimination, the widening gap between those who have and those who have not, which is leading to anger and conflict, and many other aspects such as discrimination. Massive problems that we have to try to solve. So, again, do I have hope? And here's my reasons for hope. After contemplating what we're doing to the planet, the problems, massive problems that we have to try to solve, here's the hope. First of all, more and more people are aware of the problems that we've created. But if they don't have hope and they become apathetic and they do nothing, we're doomed. So what is hope? It's not wishful thinking. To me, it's about action. And I like to see the human species at the mouth of a very long and very dark tunnel. And right at the end is a little star. It's shining. It's hope. But do we sit at the mouth of the tunnel and just wonder when that star will come to us? No. We have to roll up our sleeves, or as the Bible says, gird your loins. I'm not sure what that means, but I love it. So we must gird our loins and roll up our sleeves and crawl under, climb over, work our way around all those problems and others that I've just mentioned. And as we go along this tunnel, we reach out to others and inspire them to help. And the thing is that every single problem I've mentioned, and all of those that I haven't, there are people working to solve them. But so often they're working in silos, and they solve their problem without realizing, because they're not thinking of the whole. They don't realize that solving this problem is creating huge problems somewhere else. So cooperation, collaboration, working as a whole, going through that tunnel, holding hands with everybody around you. And if we really take action now, that's what we can do. And so, you know, even back in the early 90s, young people were losing hope. And so it's not surprising they're losing hope even more now. And I was meeting young people who were mostly apathetic, angry, depressed, back in the early 1990s. And they told me that they felt that way because we'd compromised their future and there was nothing they could do about it. As I've said, we've been stealing their future since the Industrial Revolution, maybe even since the Agricultural Revolution. But it's not true that there's nothing that can be done. And so back then, I started a program. It's now the Jane Goodall's humanitarian and environmental program for young people. It began in Dar es Salaam with 12 high school students. We decided the most important message for a group was every single one of us makes an impact on the planet every single day, and we can choose what sort of impact we make. And we decided that each group would choose 3 projects to make the world better because of this interrelatedness. 1 project to help people, 1 project to help animals, 1 project to help the environment. Or they could combine them all in 1 program or two together or something like that. They didn't all have to work on all of those projects, but they had to share the results of their work. And so they were getting a rounded picture of the problems on the planet and working out ways to solve them, rolling up their sleeves and going out, collecting litter, planting trees, raising money for various projects, learning about endangered wildlife, visiting sick children in hospital. The imagination of young people and their determination, their commitment, their enthusiasm for what they're doing is a tremendous reason for hope. That program is now in 65 countries, hundreds of thousands of groups. We have members in kindergarten, in university, everything in between. More and more adults are wanting and forming groups. And it really is a reason for hope. And when young people feel desperate and useless and helpless, and you get them involved in doing something, and they see we are making a difference, that makes them feel good and they want to do more. And then they realize that in other countries, young people like them, not only in Roots and Shoots, but the other youth groups are doing the same. That gives them hope, and that inspires them to do more for their own future. And so it's my greatest reason for hope. And the next one is the human intellect. We haven't used it wisely, but more and more scientists are coming up with innovative solutions to enable us to live in greater harmony with nature, such as renewable energy, for one example. And people, as individuals, are beginning to think, we're beginning to think, aren't we, about our own environmental footprint as we go from day to day, making ethical choices in what we buy. Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? Don't buy it. And as more and more people demand ethically made products, so consumer pressure is forcing many businesses to change the way that they do things. I could give hundreds of examples of that. And then there's the resilience of nature. And so many places that we've utterly destroyed are now full of life again. I just was in Sudbury in Canada, which is one of the largest greening projects anywhere. And I went there 20 years ago to see the difference. They're still working at it. Fish are back in lakes and rivers that were so polluted that you couldn't drink it and you got burned if you put your finger in it. Trees are covering the once bare black hills. And Gombe at one time was a tiny island of forest surrounded by bare hills because the people had cut them down to survive, to make money from charcoal or timber, or make more land to grow food to feed their growing families. But the bare hills that were there in the late 1980s are now covered in trees. And the ecosystem is beginning to be restored, and animals, plants, and so on are beginning to return to these once destroyed areas. Animals on the brink of extinction have been given another chance. I could give you so many examples of that. And it's very exciting. It's a reason for hope. And, you know, there's the indomitable spirit, people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up and so often succeed. There's people like Nelson Mandela, people like Martin Luther King. There are people who arrive in a country as a refugee with nothing, probably receive a lot of discrimination, but somehow they build a life for themselves, they get a little business, they get a little family, and they've survived against all odds because they don't give up. And people with tremendous physical disabilities are out there inspiring people around them. In Canada, I was just with one of these inspirational people. He's called Chris Koch. He was born with arms that came to here and no legs, but just one little, maybe it was a rudimentary foot coming out of one thigh. He jumps up on the sofa beside you, or you go and sit beside him on the floor. And he's one of the most vivid, alive, intelligent, enthusiastic people I know. He's got a great sense of humor. He goes around the world on his own, on a skateboard. He's amazing. And I know other inspirational people too. And that's why I carry Mr. H with me. Mr. H was given to me 29 years ago. The man thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee for my birthday. He was blind. I made him hold the tail. Gary, his name is Gary Horn, that's why he's Mr. H. Gary, chimps don't have tails. He said, never mind, take him with you and you know I'm with you in spirit. He's been to 61 countries. I tell people when they touch him, the inspiration rubs off. He's probably been touched by at least 3 million people. It would have been well over 4, but for COVID grounding us in the UK. And he decided when he went blind at 21 that he would become a magician. Everybody said, but Gary, you can't be a magician if you can't see. Well, he arranges his props beforehand. The children for whom he does shows don't realize he's blind. And at the end, he'll tell them and say, you know, things may go wrong in your life because you never know. But if they do, don't give up. There's always a way forward. And he does scuba diving. He does skydiving. But perhaps most amazing of all, he's taught himself to paint. He never painted before. And he's done a little book called Blind Artist. In it is a portrait of Mr. H. I wish I could show it to you. He's never seen him, only felt him. And it's the most amazing painting. I have the original framed in our office. So that's the message that I want to give to you. And I was given, well, many gifts when I was born, but 2 have been very important to me. One was good health, good genes. I mean, you know, I can do things that many 88-year-olds can't do. And am I going to retire? No, or how could I? You know, and the older you get, the less time you have to live, although we don't know how long it'll be. Therefore, you've got to speed up because there's so much more to do. And so the other gift that I was given was to be able to communicate. And I've always known from the age of a very young age that I had a gift for writing. I loved writing. I still love writing. I don't have much time for it, but I love it. And I didn't know that I could speak in public. I was terrified. I never stood up at school. I never answered or asked a question. The first time I ever rushed forward to ask questions was when a man came to school and he brought all kinds of reptiles and things with him. And of course, with my love of animals, I just had to go and talk to him. But normally I was really shy. And when I had to give my first speech, I couldn't sleep for nights. And I kind of practiced it and with my poor, long-suffering family. And I made a vow at that time. I will never read a speech, and I won't say and Well, you probably haven't heard many ums and ers, I think, maybe 1 or 2, because I didn't have time to really prepare this the way I would have liked. But, you know, it is, well, I have to do it a little bit, don't I? Well, forget the ums. I made that first speech, and after about 3 minutes, when I felt I didn't breathe, I found that people were listening, and I could do it. Well, of course, I practiced and practiced it and honed it, but it's quite amazing to me that people come, they come to my lectures, they come and listen, they laugh or they cry, and it's a gift. It's nothing to do with me. It's a gift that I was given when I was born, and I try to use it wisely. And so let me end by saying something that Thoreau wanted, Thoreau for his whole life, and I want to get this right, because I didn't have time to do it all properly. He Anyway, he spent his life seeking for truth and wisdom and a better life for people and animals. And that's the best thing I think all of us could do. So finally, thank you again. Thank you everybody who's helped. Thank you for acknowledging that gift I was given to be able to write. And let's hope each one of us remembers every day we make a difference, and we can choose what sort of difference we make. Thank you.